Hi, I'm Knowles. I'm a senior lecturer at Lancaster University. I'm really excited to share this paper with you today. We wrote it because we feel we have something important to say, and that's this. There are perfectly legitimate ways of thinking about trust and trustworthiness, or even trusted and trustworthy AI, which just don't make sense when you apply them to the matter of public trust in AI. Public trust in AI is something that's almost universally seen as important, but scholarship around the nature of public trust in AI is severely underdeveloped. So we wrote this paper to make the point that public trust in AI is actually radically different to expert trust in individual AI systems. And this wasn't to score points for being contrary or own some new framework that we do, develop a framework, but because understanding what's different about public trust in AI has really important implications for how we go about fostering this trust that we say is so important. So, here are some of the key points that we explore in the paper. The first relates to the idea that trust is necessary for adoption. That if people don't trust it, then the uptake of this technology will be limited, and therefore this will limit our ability to realize the societal benefits that could come from AI. So we argue in the paper that as prevalent as this rationale is for the importance of trust in AI, this really doesn't make sense. At least for any member of the public, there's no choice not to adopt AI. The argument for focusing on public trust in AI that makes sense is one that springs from a moral basis. So, what it means to individuals to be surrounded by technology that they fundamentally don't or can't or maybe even shouldn't trust. The second distinction that we make in the paper is that public trust in AI isn't about, and actually, in fact, can't be about, trust in the various different AIs that the public encounters in their world. That reasoning, so deciding whether a particular AI system is trustworthy, is something that an expert might be able to undertake. For example, when it comes to figuring out how much to rely on an AI-based recommendation, but it really doesn't scale to the reality of a world in which AI is pervasive. The only kind of trust that scales to this context is a type of trust called institutional trust. And we argue that when people trust or distrust AI, they're trusting or distrusting in AI as an institution. In other words, AI as an abstraction, which on the whole either can or cannot be assumed to be trustworthy. And this leads to the next point, which is that approaches to the challenge of fostering trust in AI rely on individuals being able to evaluate and determine the trustworthiness of particular AIs. A lot of solutions are geared towards helping end users understand the trustworthiness of individual AIs. And the public, quite simply, doesn't have the ability to do this. Even if one is technically able, which, let's face it, is going to be pretty rare, there are simply too many AI-based systems that we encounter in our lives. We already don't have time to read terms and conditions. We already don't understand cookies. It's too big an ask to expect members of the public to develop trust in AIs by committing to understanding how each of these different AIs work. And so, as important as it is for AI to be explainable to someone, that someone is not the public. Fairness, robustness, explainability, these things pertain to the trustworthiness of AI systems, but on their own don't promote public trust in AI. And in the absence of something else which offers a guarantee that one can reasonably trust the AIs that pervade their world, we can't expect public trust in AI to increase. So in the paper, we do offer a means of promoting public trust in AI, as promised in the title. If you examine the trusted AI literature, you'll notice that there's this particular orientation to trust, specifically this idea that trust arises through a process of rationally assessing evidence of trustworthiness. And distrust, therefore, is either a response to having determined something is untrustworthy or not having access to enough evidence of trustworthiness. In general, the literature assumes that the AI in question is trustworthy, but that the end user isn't able to understand this and needs to be shown more evidence of trustworthiness. And this is the basic premise underlying all of explainable AI. It's the same information deficit model seen in science communication. There's nothing inherently wrong with this way of understanding trust. This is rooted in the famous ability, benevolence, integrity, or ABI model, which helps explain how people come to trust in some situations, but doesn't make sense when it comes to public trust in AI. Now is maybe a good time to define what we mean by public. So for precision, I'll use the exact language from the paper. By the public, we mean average, relatively non-technical citizens, individuals who encounter AI as an abstruse component of their digital milieu. So for these individuals, let's see if the ABI model makes sense. According to this model, there are 3 stages along the journey to trusting. The first is belief, which arises through 1, assessing the ability, benevolence, and integrity of a person or a system, and then continually monitoring whether this person or system behaves predictably. Now, this would be a lot to ask of any member of the public with respect to any individual AI, but completely ludicrous in a world of pervasive AI, particularly when the public already faces difficulties and even recognizing when they're interacting with AI. The second stage, the decision stage, is often framed as a willingness to make oneself vulnerable on the basis of having assessed risks associated with trusting a person or a system. But assessing risk as it relates to AI is actually incredibly difficult and quite different to the kinds of scenarios where one is considering whether they can rely on someone or something. The third stage is action, or taking an action on the basis of trust. In this context, this would mean adopting the AI in question. But the public doesn't have meaningful choice to adopt or reject AI. AI components are embedded within digital technologies. Soon, all technologies will have some element of AI, and every decision will be informed by AI. Now, the important point to make here is that the ability to reject an untrustworthy party helps encourage the trustee to be more trustworthy. This action stage is a fundamental requirement of accountability. And we just don't believe that the public can take action in this way. And this is so important because the prevailing narrative, as I mentioned at the start, is that if the public doesn't trust AI, then they'll reject it. And therefore, there are these powerful market forces which work to ensure that the AI is trustworthy. But without this action stage, those market forces don't have any real weight or significance. So if the public is severely limited in their ability to process trust in AI at each of these 3 stages, then we need a new model that explains better how the public processes trust and therefore how trust in AI can be fostered. All right, so let's try an analogy. You're about to board an airplane, if you can remember such times. Would you like to see the maintenance logs for the engines? Would you like to see at each point that the pilots have performed their pre-flight checks? Or when you board that airplane, is it not sufficient to trust that aviation is highly regulated, it's safe, that any breach of safety protocols anywhere in the life cycle of design, construction, test, monitoring, and maintenance is sanctioned for all to see? Now, this is a fantastically ingenious shortcut that we've had to develop out of necessity in socially complex societies where one-to-one trust formation just doesn't scale, and where more specialized expertise is needed to evaluate trustworthiness. We don't trust the individual, we trust the system. And specifically, we trust that the system, in this example, the aviation sector, has appropriate mechanisms for ensuring trustworthiness. As long as that system works and we don't have to worry about the trustworthiness of the individual flight. All right, so this kind of trust is called institutional trust. And it's something that's been studied as a characteristic of late modern societies. In other words, we're not inventing a new kind of trust here. This type of trust is known and studied in sociology and psychology. And it's something we're exceptionally comfortable with in our daily lives. You know, go to the supermarket Are you assessing whether each and every item on the shelves can be trusted, or are you trusting in systems that regulate food and other consumer products? In the paper, we apply a basic formulation of institutional trust to this context of public trust in AI. We call this trust in AI as an institution. This formulation sees the system or the institution as being mediated through 3 dimensions of structure, which, if working correctly, provide the rules that the institution aims to uphold and the means of enforcing those rules so that the institution and its individual members can be trusted. So this requires us to briefly dip into some heavy sociology. The signification dimension refers to the language of symbols and symbolic actions that make sense in the context of a given institution. For example, we've come to understand that a person wearing a white coat in a hospital is a doctor. Legitimation provides norms and values, and these are reinforced and made visible through sanctioning members of the institution who violate these expectations. Domination refers to the ways that power can be applied within the institution. Certain agents are empowered through various resources, which I'll come to in a minute. So according to this formulation, trust arises through a perception of coherence between these dimensions, or in other words, the system is capable of impelling individuals to conform to various norms, which are commonly understood through a shared language. So how do outsiders gauge whether an institution is functioning effectively in this way and can be trusted? This is through something called face work. The actions of members of the institution provide clues. For example, if a company flaunts their disregard of consumer safety and gets away with it, this signals an institutional failure to ensure trustworthiness. So, if the public can only meaningfully relate to AI as an institution, then we have to consider how these individual dimensions can be developed and supported, as well as how they might work together coherently. With regards to signification, there are some tricky questions about how we indicate and recognize trustworthy AI, and also how specific features of AI map to various social harms or risks. For legitimation, there are important questions about what is the normative culture of AI? What does the pattern of sanctions tell us about what rules AI is playing by? Who's developing the norms and values that AI is expected to live up to? But also, do these map to public values? What the public demands of AI? As for domination, do we have laws? Are they enforceable? Who's supposed to apply sanctions against AI? And finally, to whom are AIs ultimately accountable? And all of this really boils down to the need to develop a robust regulatory ecosystem which provides some guarantee that the public is protected from harmful consequences of AI. So let's summarize the paper contributions so far. One, we wanted to show that public trust in AI is different from interpersonal trust or even expert trust in AI. And we've identified the relevant type of trust as being institutional trust. This is critical for understanding that fostering public trust in AI isn't simply a case of providing end users with better explanations. In fact, in the paper, we argue that explainable AI has no role in fostering public trust in AI and would indeed reduce trust insofar as it signals that there are no institutional guarantees and that individuals are responsible for making informed choices. Instead, we need to develop this regulatory ecosystem. So now I'll turn to the third contribution, which is the pivotal role of AI documentation in enabling this ecosystem. So remember, one of the characteristics of an institution which functions in ways that foster trust in its members is that it has a means of sanctioning members who don't meet certain standards. So in order to be trusted, AI as an institution would need to develop a means of systematically weeding out AIs deemed harmful or risky so that what remains is trustworthy. There have, of course, been calls for AI-specific legislation, but for this legislation to have teeth, as the saying goes, then we first need something to chew on. In other words, we would need to develop resources that empower these agents to sanction untrustworthy AI. And this would imply the need for some form of documentation, which can be interpreted by these skilled agents. Of course, we note that this isn't actually what AI documentation is currently designed for. Things like IBM fact sheets, data sheets for data sets, model cards. These are designed to document compliance with a company's own ethical standards, or convey relevant information to someone purchasing or implementing AI components. But if our argument holds so far, then we would need to explore how to adapt AI documentation to account for trustworthiness to regulators and independent auditors. We argue that there is important work to do in developing a shared language for communicating facts about AIs, which can be assessed consistently by these auditors. And we also propose that over time, we might expect to develop a sort of case law regarding past decisions about AI systems, which can be referred to internally within this documentation. We also argue in this paper that these dimensions or these components would need to co-evolve over time. The institution needs to develop an understanding of trustworthiness first, and this needs to be specified formally, which allows for these norms to be enforced. And finally, there are certain mechanisms which visibly promote or give clues to the trustworthiness of AIs. That's that FAcework concept again. All of these iterations are needed to grow public trust in AI. Finally, some high-level takeaways. We're certain that the public is incapable of determining the trustworthiness of individual AIs. But we don't need them to do this. It's not their responsibility to keep AI honest. The public doesn't need to know how an AI works in order to trust it. They just need to know that someone or somebody with the necessary skill set is examining AI and has the authority to mete out sanctions. Also, AI documentation is key, but if we fail to recognize the previous 2 points, then there's a good chance that the future of AI documentation will be yet another terms and conditions style consent mechanism, something that no one really reads or understands. We need to reimagine AI documentation in ways that empower auditors to assess trustworthiness. Finally, a regulatory ecosystem is the only way that AI will be accountable to the public, thereby earning public trust. I started by saying that the idea that trust in AI is necessary for adoption doesn't make sense. Well, it also depoliticizes really important moral issues surrounding AI, making it seem as though trustworthiness is secondary to whether consumers can be convinced or even tricked to adopt it. AI has material consequences in our world. It affects real people. And we need genuine accountability to ensure that the AI that pervades our world is helping to make that world better. That's AI that the public ought to trust. So thank you so much for listening. I'm looking forward to answering questions, and do feel free to get in touch.